I'd like to express my deep appreciation to the entire staff of the Mitchell Center for their extraordinary dedication and amazing teamwork in organizing this wonderful event. It's now a great pleasure to welcome Professor Bill Clark to the University of Maine and to thank him for being with us to present this year's Senator George J. Mitchell Lecture on Sustainability. Bill is one of the leading scholars in the world focused on sustainable development, perhaps the greatest challenge of our time. In asking how we can improve the well-being of humanity while protecting the planet, the challenge of sustainability raises far more questions than we have ready answers. Regardless of whether these challenges involve how we live in cities and towns, how we get our food, water, and energy, or how we dispose of our wastes, they are definitely not simple problems, and they defy simple solutions. Bill has spent his career wrestling with such thorny problems and searching for better ways to solve them. He began developing his unique skills during his PhD research at the University of British Columbia, where he learned from one of the Zen masters of systems thinking, Buzz Halling. Systems analysis is sometimes described as a way of thinking which recognizes that the whole is much more than the sum of its parts. Such thinking also emphasizes that a complete understanding of the system and the ability to predict the system's future often lies far beyond our grasp. Bill's expertise in systems thinking makes him particularly well suited to tackling real-world sustainability problems, where one of the most important navigational aids on the road to solutions is a kind of methodical trial and error called adaptive management. Systems thinking also reminds us that our well-intentioned attempts to fix a particular problem sometimes lead to new and unforeseen snags. This is exactly the type of predicament that once caused journalist Eric Sevareid to say, no doubt in a fascinating blend of irony and exasperation, the chief cause of our problems is solutions. Bill's work suggests that universities have great potential to help society solve sustainability problems. And to reach this potential, they need to mobilize their full complement of expertise in the many different facets of sustainability challenges, not just expertise in natural science and engineering, that's certainly needed, but also in the social sciences, arts, and humanities. Bill would be the first to admit that the knowledge produced in universities isn't guaranteed to change the world. Fortunately, his research also shows how scholars can collaborate more effectively with citizens, the private sector, and government to make a real difference in our world. Did I mention that Bill has received a bit of recognition for his long-standing focus on the challenge of sustainability? Not only was he awarded a MacArthur Genius Prize and elected to the National Academy of Sciences, he is one of the co-founders of an entirely new field of science, sustainability science. For the last 5 years, more than 100 faculty and several hundred students from across the state have participated in the Sustainability Solutions Initiative, a Maine-grown response to Bill's call for research that focuses on solving real-world sustainability problems. So it seems only right that, as we're about to graduate from a pioneering initiative to a permanent center of sustainability, Bill is here to help illuminate the road ahead. Please join me in welcoming Bill Clark.
So, thank you very much, David, President Hunter, Senator Mitchell, for both the honor and the opportunity to present the Senator George J. Mitchell Lecture on Sustainability. And I should say, unscripted, I also have to call out Bob and Ellie Cates here in the front row, who are both the reason I know something about this subject, the reason I've been unable to escape it, and my lifelong tutors and mentors in why Maine is a good idea. So Bob and Ellie, thank you so much for everything. As a teacher in a school of government, I'm also particularly glad, not to say awed, by the opportunity to be giving a lecture here in Maine, a state that, for reasons I still don't understand, has done far more than its share to give government a good name in the United States. I grew up in a household of, this was before I met the Cates, I thought were radical socialists, whose one comment as a politician I as a kid should pay attention to was Margaret Chase Smith, who, despite their own personal political leanings, was always their great hero for a person who knew the difference between position and fundamental values and expressed them courageously. As a college student, struggling with my interest in environmental science on the one hand, but my interest in changing the world on the other, Senator Ed Muskie, who appeared across my bows in a number of different fortuitous circumstances, showed that there were people coming from the other side, not my side of science, but the side of changing the world, who paid attention to science, who were interested in hearing about what we had to say, pushing us on its relevance to real people running real businesses, real jobs, having real grandchildren, and so on, lessons for which I will be forever grateful. And then as a young professional, I found myself trying to patch together how it could be that climate change and acid rain and biodiversity change and so on were somehow tangled together environmentally, only to come across Senator Mitchell's then new book, The World on Fire, in which it was abundantly clear that at least this politician was way out ahead of us in the science community in seeing the connections among these different features, ways in which we as humans were not picking out one problem at a time, but were doing things which were changing in an integrated, if David will, systems way, the challenges we were all facing. I'm grateful to all of them. I do realize that there are other distinguished politicians active even today in Maine, but given how close we are to an election, I will stop talking about them. So, that said, the real reason I'm actually here to talk about this subject reflects less on Maine's leading politicians and more on their leading pest, particularly the spruce budworm. Now, why? As a graduate student back in the mid-1970s, I found myself just across the border in New Brunswick, part of the army of scientists and forest managers and concerned citizens and politicians struggling to sustain the well-being of a society intimately bound up with its natural resource base, in front of one of its recurrent outbreaks of an insect that wanted to use the forest too, but in different ways than people did. My role in this battle as a mere graduate student was a minor one, but it took me on the beginning steps of the journey that brings me here today. I moved slowly, too slowly, from being somebody saying, the interesting thing here is what's causing this outbreak, to saying, no, the interesting thing here is why those wretched scientists in Maine are sowing confusion to us Canadians by measuring things with silly units like miles and Fahrenheit and bugs per square foot, which, as the junior guy in the team, my whole job, I thought some days was just translating those into English, Canadian English. To why won't those politicians listen to us experts who think we understand this situation? To slowly understanding that the problem was also partly why are we experts who understand all things known to heaven and earth about budworms, not actually studying the stuff that the forest managers, the people running paper companies, the people trying to keep the employment rate up, needed to know in order to sustain their lives in the front of this pest. And finally, into an uneasy collaboration that led to a shared understanding of what needed to be managed was not the insect, but the forest, And what we needed to do it was not my research on insect dispersal or a fleet of old World War II bombers carrying DDT, but rather a change in the New Brunswick's Crown Lands Act, which gave the state an uneasy and unenthusiastically received ability to intervene and ask property owners to do forest thinning and forest management that would substitute for loss of jobs on the one hand or tons of DDT spraying on the other to control this beast. Now, obviously from what is in your newspapers and the website of your forest department today, we did not solve the budworm problem. But we did give me a supreme education in the difference between studying what's most interesting scientifically and grappling with trying to discover what things that a scientist might contribute would most help people get on with their lives, their well-being, and ensuring the lives of their kids. It was, in short, a specific step on the route to the subject of this lecture, which is, what have we learned around the world about the general problem of mobilizing science and technology to help people develop their own lives and that of their kids sustainably into the future? And as my point of departure, I'll simply assert that, at least in my travels around the world, two things are true. One, there are oodles of scholars, young people in universities, inventors off in garages, humanists writing about human-environment interactions and so on, who desperately, urgently want the stuff they know or are learning to help people craft better lives for themselves, to support good policymaking and corporate decision-making. At the same time, around the world, there are practitioners in business, in government, in community work, who very much want the contribution, want to talk more with scientists and engineers to get to understand how they see the world rather than simply seeing it in terms of ideology and self-interest. There's a lovely article up on the center's webpage about student work here, actually documenting that legislators would prefer to get more of their information from scientists, not some of them I know, but more of their information from scientists than from the newspapers, but they can't seem to make the connection. So the desire is there, both to receive more science and technical knowledge, and to make that knowledge useful to people, and sometimes it works, but too often it doesn't. We pile up reams and reams of unread reports, books, treatises. We pile up even more piles of people trying to move development forward on the front lines of business, community action, and governance, not supported by the kind of knowledge and analysis that they think they most need. So can't we do better at that, about meeting supply and demand, bringing these two sides together? The good news, of course, is that despite the many failures and the piling up, unused research and so on, we also have a modicum of successes. We have things we can learn from. Now that can be the vernal pools work that I just read about from the Center for Sustainable Solutions here. It can be Senator Mitchell's work on the Clean Air Act, which used more science than we even had at the time to move forward a truly miraculous legislative agenda. Where are you now, please? Internationally, it can be things like the Green Revolution agricultural institutes that simply brought a stampede of publicly minded scientists, plant breeders, and so on from all around the world to try to create crops that poor people needed to improve their lives. So I've been working with colleagues at the National Academy of Sciences over the past dozen years or so, trying to collect these successful examples of mobilizing science to really advance people's ability to shape the futures they want for themselves and their kids, and trying to extract from those some lessons as to it isn't a cookbook, it isn't that we know how to do this, but some properties that relatively successful efforts seem to share broadly, and therefore perhaps form a foundation on which any of us could base our next effort in our own community, in our own business, in our own government circles, to move on to the next step without making all of the mistakes of the past for ourselves. And I'll summarize those in four big deliveries in the course of this lecture. But before I begin, I simply want to be clear. Most of this is going to seem old hat to most of you who are older than 20. That it's not that if you actually do this stuff as a major part of your life, you don't sort of get it eventually, as Senator Mitchell was remarking over lunch. It's not that you read the right book on becoming a great negotiator. It's that you're a bad negotiator, and then you get to be a little bit better negotiator. And if you don't bail out of the field, you eventually become a pretty good negotiator. That said, we all know things like how you connect knowledge with action, but we sure don't do a very good job of codifying it, of training our graduate students in it, of teaching our freshmen as they come in, all set to change the world, that here are some mistakes you don't necessarily have to make all of for yourself, but there are some ways forward. That is, there is some accumulating wisdom here. So my challenge is back to you to say, make this the beginning of a conversation, not the end, of how we take some of this common sense accumulated wisdom that has bubbled up from thousands of experiments, most of them failures, some of them successes, and turn it into something that we are passing on in our classrooms, in our laboratories, in our corporations, so that more people are building on top of it, so that we don't find ourselves falling into the same pits along the way. All right, so moving from preamble to doing it. Start off a little bit with the notion of, before we worry about how you make it, what would influential knowledge anyway be? I mean, for knowledge, I'm going to mean everything from the craft skill of how to be a good fisherman, to the technical knowledge of what your sensor tells you where the fish are today, to the knowledge embodied in the boat you run and the equipment you've got and so on. So it's this whole thing of formal, informal stuff from laboratories and so on and so on. Influential knowledge is harder. Now, there is some. I've been involved in efforts to get new harvest rules for budworm, of new ways of doing rice cultivation in low water, high human capacity areas, new cook stoves to limit deaths from indoor air pollution, even new Ebola vaccines. But I don't want to tell you so much about my cases as invite you to pause for just a minute and think of a really tough case in your own experience. One in which either as a potential user of technical information, you found it difficult to get it from people who ought to have it, or as a researcher, somebody who's discovered stuff or knows about things that you just cannot imagine why is not being picked up in practice by people in business, government, and so on. Think of a real case and use that as the reference point for making sense of, critiquing, or asking what you would add to the points that come. Only by doing that and making this your own am I going to make any sense at all. I think the stand and deliver line for me as an often purveyor of, let me show you this new harvesting technology, or this new fact about how to mess up budworms' ability to smell each other or something, is the following question. Why on earth would a person I don't know possibly trust my new knowledge or widget enough to change their behavior, especially when the health of their families, the survival of their business, their political career might well be on the line as a result of their change in behavior. And they know, as Senator Mitchell was pointing out in a meeting earlier today, at the end of the day, I'm going home, and they're not. They're going to live the problem. So what is it that would make this new widget or idea I'm turning over to them, I'm offering to them, something that they would trust enough to bet their very lives on it? This is a hard question. I'm not sure any of us know the answer, but in some pretty serious digging, I think what we've come up is in most cases such information, the widget I'm offering, needs to meet 3 criteria, not just one. Credibility, believability is the one that certainly any of us raised in a university framework recognize. It has to have gotten through peer review. It has to have been tested. FDA has to have recognized that it's effective and safe. And that surely matters. What we've discovered, though, is that by and large, that is not enough to get people to bet their lives and their kids on new knowledge. The new knowledge also has to be speaking to intensely felt needs that they have. You actually have to have figured out what their problem is rather than your problem. And it has to be legitimate in the sense, or fair, in the sense that they believe not only do you know what you're talking about, and you've listened hard to their problem, but you're not actually shilling for somebody else. You're not on someone else's side, dressing up an argument that they should change what they do simply to advance someone else's agenda, even as you masquerade as a scientist. And we've called this the saliency, credibility, legitimacy trilogy. And way to think about it is, I do some work in the developing world, so imagine that you're a village and you see on the other side of the river a community is actually built up, has some purchasing power, and if you could only get your agricultural goods over there, you would actually make a little bit of spare income. So you call in an expert, Bob Cates, for instance, and studies it, said, what should we do? And Cates finally says, you should build a bridge. And it's a bridge like this, and you could construct it this way, and trust me, it will stand up and it won't wash away, and that's the best thing for you to do. So the first thing you do is say, well, does this guy know anything about building bridges? And you ask around, and he's built other bridges before, and they haven't washed out in the first spring flood, so this is okay. Was he addressing your problem? Yeah, because this would actually be a way to get your goods across the river really quickly while they would get a good market price in the village. So he's hit credibility and he's hit saliency. And you're just about to sign on the dotted line and give him his huge consulting fee when you discover that his non-existent brother-in-law sells bridges for a living. Now, it's interesting. This doesn't mean he doesn't know how to build bridges. It doesn't mean that he's not solving your problem. But your willingness to bet the bank, I think for most of us, just went down considerably because it's not clear whether he's solving his brother-in-law's problem or yours. And I think one of the hardest lessons, certainly for me as a techie to learn, is that virtually anything we do in this sustainable development arena as technical knowledge producers is born political. It's trying to get people to change from doing one thing or another, and so it is not at all unreasonable that the people we're talking to should distrust us, should wonder whose side we're really on, and should demand of us some record of past accomplishment, demonstration of good faith, and so on, that bring us into the game. So, for me, the thing we're trying to produce is influential knowledge that is not only salient or relevant to the needs of the people we're trying to help, rather than our own visions of what they should want. It's credible not just to us, but to them by criteria they care about. And it has demonstrated some degree of legitimacy or fairness or regard to their own justified suspicions that we're actually working for someone else. So how do we accomplish that? Four sets of things that I think have bubbled up as fairly effective a good bit of the time. The first is that efforts to mobilize knowledge for sustainable development in ways that are influential almost always turn out to be strongly collaborative exercises. So what's the problem here? The problem is that too often the alternative is mutual incomprehension. The scientists and technical people don't really understand what the fishermen or the foresters or the family worried about health effects of insecticide spraying really haven't taken the trouble to find out what their concerns and hopes and fears are about. Similarly, the people on the action line really don't know what the scientists and engineers have to offer or are talking about. And that non-dialogue can go on forever with very bad effects. We've seen it in the huge amount invested in cook stoves around the world over the last 10 years. Indoor air pollution from cook stoves kills huge numbers of kids, mostly kids and women. Sensible people have come in to design more efficient cook stoves and gotten them to burn cleaner and so on, without ever figuring out how many things people in much of the developing world use cook stoves for. One of them is to deliver the right heat to cook the foods they cook, rather than just any heat. One is often to use the smoke to kill off things scurrying around in the rafters that you don't want scurrying around. And on and on and on. My most ignominious encounter with this was working in a village in Kenya that I had just come into and was looking at their windows, which, as some of you know, there are really, really small. I said, well, why don't you build bigger windows? Because the smoke would go out. And they just turned to me with this pitying, kind look and said, yes, but the leopards would come in. I was not solving their problem. I was solving my problem. And we can do this. Neglected crops, 50% of the world's food comes from 3 crops. There are 12,000 crops or so out there that might have R&D put into them to work better, to deliver nutritious, drought-resistant, food under lots of circumstances. We don't do it because we're not listening to people's needs on the ground. Obvious, sure, but like I'm sure several of you, I was struck by an article in the New York Times a few weeks back that was heralding this wonderful new innovation laboratory at one of our more prestigious technical universities that will remain nameless since someone's taping this, which trumpeted the amazing fact that when they had gotten their engineers to actually go out into the community and talk to the people whose problems they were trying to solve, rather than solve them from their benches in the school, imagining what those problems were, not only did they get more solutions, but they got the students vastly more interested in what was going on. This is an elite teaching university. Surprise. So what do? The prescription is, of course, to get away from old models of one-way technology transfer. We know the problem, we know the answer, just do what we tell you. Getting away from approaches to science communication, sorry, my lunch companions, which really amount to yelling louder and using simpler words to convey exactly the same one-directional message. Learning to listen instead of to talk. Collaborative efforts, in short, in which producers of knowledge and users of knowledge learn to listen to one another, talk back and forth, negotiating not only what the problem is, but what kind of evidence would make sense to you, what would you find convincing, and crucially, who gets to make the choice and recommendation at the end of the day. We've had many examples. The one I saw here looking at these accomplishments in Maine of late is this Maine Futures Community Mapper, which seems to have engaged every imaginable interest group in the state in beginning to build some shared visions of alternative futures for Maine. I've been involved in things like it in Africa. They're really impressive. The challenge is how scholars and practitioners can collaborate in doing this sort of stuff more often, of not making it news that a modern technical university has just discovered that this might actually be a better way of doing things than sitting in a new iLab, shiny, shiny iLab, imagining what audiences needed from them in order to make their next zigabuck. Okay, so second, called the systems enterprise. Mobilizing knowledge for sustainable development, I would argue, does need a systems perspective, otherwise I'm not living up to David's introduction. Why? Because the way we as a techie community, unless we work for a really big vertically organized firm, tend to be fragmenters. The image I've used sometimes is, imagine that you wanted to invent the first automobile, and you assigned the job not to Henry Ford or J.E. Pierce or whoever, but to a university. And each professor got to work on the part of the imagined automobile that they found most interesting. And you'd get this really cool transmission and probably a really strong piston or two. Almost inconceivable anyone would invent a tire or a drivetrain. And at the end of the day, you would have a pile of really, really neat inventions and signaling technologies and probably anti-collision devices using radar. But there would be no possible way this stuff would come together to generate a piece of transportation. And why? Because all the professors would have said, I don't want to do that, the transmission. I want to do this thing that's really cool and interesting. That's why you become a professor, is because you don't want to take orders from people. And so we're left with automobiles that look like they were built by professors, vaccines that have billions of dollars put into them but demand a cold chain to preserve them and make them use, which doesn't exist in all the parts of the world that they would be using it. Household solar energy getting a huge push without the smart grids that would make it actually usable as part of a national energy strategy. NASA investing gigadollars in satellite sensing technologies and almost nothing in the downloading capacity and information processing that would make that useful to people around the world. So the prescription, appallingly for universities, is what business would call project management. You don't commission people to build the part of the car they want. You organize a project to build a car, and you'll know when it's delivered because somebody can drive from point A to point B in an affordable way. And you order, cajole, induce, incentivize, tell them you'll give them tenure to the folks you want to work on the essential but mundane parts of that technology. This is not commonly the way universities are organized. Decreasingly, it's even the way business research laboratories are organized, which is perhaps even more distressing. It is why it is interesting to see Maine so far out front introducing a solutions center. And I think the superb challenge of that is going to be how well you can assemble and sustain teams that are doing not only the really interesting stuff, but the mundane connectivity. Now, it can be done. The Global Fund for AIDS, TB, and Malaria that has been working in the health sector over the last decade came pretty close to pulling this off in that arena with a huge set of increases in what we're delivering on the ground. In the United States, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, whose administrator you had here last year, did this utterly brilliant set of things that, having discovered that they just had the new computers that would let computers and sensor arrays that would let you do an 18-month ahead forecast of when one of these El Nino type events was very likely to change your rainfall and storminess, that they recognized, unlike many before them, that if they simply stopped there and improve the next 2 or 3 or 5% in the prediction capacity of these just astounding sets of data arrays and computers, it would only be useful to a tiny fraction of very wealthy corporations and countries. So what NOAA managed to do, I still would love to know the story of how they did it, was establish around the United States and abroad a set of bridging institutions whose entire job was to go out and find people who could potentially benefit from that information, whether they were farmers or people responsible for managing water supplies or snowmelt pack and so on, and build the connecting tissue between the kind of decision tools those people used and the kinds of outputs that these snazzy new climatological computer models would generate. And that often ended up building institutions of 10 or 20 people, building local trust relationships, an absolutely fabulous accomplishment, showing what can be done when you take solving the problem rather than just doing the neat science as the guideline. So moving ahead, thinking of the really hard problem you promised me you would be thinking of, I think the question is how we, on the research side, bridge this always false dichotomy between basic research is what smart people do and applied research is what the rest do, and understand that some of the greatest scientists and scholars in history, Louis Pasteur, the most notable, have made their careers precisely by moving fluidly back and forth between talking with milkmaids and veterinarians in the morning and discovering the germ theory of disease back in their laboratory in the afternoon. We universities are among the worst offenders, along with our funding sources, in keeping that dichotomy there, which has neither historical nor instrumental roots and excuses to it. How can we, therefore, fund, staff, and reward performance in the kinds of institutions, whether in academia or in the public sector or even in government laboratories, that integrate those two ends of cutting-edge research and intimate engagement with practice on the ground to produce solutions, that is, real cars, rather than just neat parts, a systems enterprise. Third piece is doing this job right turns out to be an adaptive enterprise. As was stressed in my introduction, I think one of the things any of us have worked in the world, this is why I said this wouldn't be news to you, is that we're not very good at predicting what's going to happen when we throw a new technology or a new policy into play in the world. They never work out the way they were supposed to. That's not to say we shouldn't do them or we shouldn't try to do forward assessments and views. It says that we just don't get it right. And therefore, the systems we design have to be ones not that are built around getting answers, but ones that are built around helping us to learn faster and faster what works, what would have to be adjusted, what gets thrown out, and so on. And we do a bunch of things that are just backwards from that. Part of it is risk aversion, a very individual psychology grounded stuff, but one we then enforce in most of our institutions, which says only do the safe stuff, guarantee success. A colleague of mine working in a good industrial research lab said that he would have fired any teams in his group that had success rates of higher than 30% in the technology development they did. For those of you in academia, any of you who have a less than 30% success rate in your NSF research, who's going to tell NSF? I mean, this is not what we reward. This is not what you would brag about in your promotion regime. I will dare say even this is not what you brag about on the floor of the Senate, telling people how many bills you have put forward that have tanked because you didn't get it right. It's also a matter of hubris. So we don't take risks. The things we do, we just dig in and insist that they must have been successes and ought to persist forever. And obviously, a current main example is in which you're out actually ahead of the rest of us, is discovering that many of these dams that we put in place in an earlier era to do perfectly good things would have been better if they had had an instruction manual for taking them apart, a drain attached, and any number of things that said the fact that a dam is a good thing now and here doesn't mean it will always be one. As we think forward with big new energy technology systems, to pay more attention to the ones we might want to decommission and take apart someday, and the ones we wouldn't, and which score better on those grounds, not just on the grounds of 2% better on the kilowatt hour costs. And to recognize finally that I'm grading into my last topic, but that often what we face in this world of trying to get information to policymakers and decision makers in a useful way is a world which many natural scientists and engineers find hard to imagine, but one in which people are actually feeding disinformation and lying about things on purpose, trying to stop the spread of useful knowledge rather than promote it. I have many examples from many things I've done, but in order to keep this definitely American but non-Maine focused, I will simply cite the wonderful action of the North Carolina legislature in prohibiting state planners from using any information on anticipated sea level rise in any planning that they do. The problem these guys face isn't how do I talk about sea level rise, what's the confidence in my numbers? It's that they're forbidden by law from telling people that if you build this thing on the coast, it's going to be underwater in 10 years. Now, whose interests are being served there, you might ask? You would probably get the answer. Process prescription, complicated, but I think a shift for many of us of going from the notion that the business we're in is knowing things to the business we're in is learning about things. A very famous physicist once said that the business of science was not to reject hypotheses or this or that, it was to make mistakes at the fastest possible rate and the least possible cost. That is to move from trying out a lot of things, acknowledging most of them wouldn't work, and moving on to the next. Most of our research labs, most of our universities, most of our tenure and promotion procedures simply do not work that way. And yet, we build them, we can change them. So why aren't we changing them? Challenge, how can we, in essence, move into this adaptive management realm? Okay, the last piece of venture, since those were so easy, understanding, many of us went into science and engineering because politics was too scary or nasty or mean, and we knew that all scientists and engineers were nice, so it would be okay. And what it does is mean that there is a very strong technocratic bias. Maybe that's an oxymoron. To what we do. We're involved in just the facts. Okay? You put them on the table, and if the state legislator says you can't consider them, that's their problem, not yours. Well, the fact is that if we're doing science that matters, and certainly in sustainable development it matters, it's about whether our kids have a future or not, almost all the knowledge we foster into that situation is born political. That is, it's going to be a chip in the greatest redistribution agenda the world has ever seen. Sustainable development at its core is a redistribution agenda. It's saying, are we benefiting in the present at the cost of future generations? And if so, too much? Should we change that? It's saying, are we benefiting here by shipping our dirty industry overseas? If so, should we change that? Facts brought onto that table are weapons in the most intense political arguments you can imagine. And so we, the chickens bringing the technical bits to the table, should hardly be surprised when we're attacked, not because our p-values were wrong, but because people just don't like the political implications of the facts that we're bringing to the table. They suspect we may be shilling for the enemy, whoever their particular enemy is. And we see this happening over and over again. We see it in, I read a little bit about forest certification, obviously a purely technical issue here in Maine. We should just want the best certification scheme. And I see people are having almost up to duels at sunrise over which certification technical scheme is best. It's obviously an issue of which benefits whom. And one could go on and on with the list. What we need to be doing, I would say, is even in the most obscure and theoretical sciences, is convincing our folks, ourselves, that if we want to play in the real world, we need to be reflexive about the power implications, about the taking sides involved. The minute we pick to study this problem rather than that problem, the minute we pick to take this evidence as definitive rather than that one, and certainly when we pick, as we often have to, whose case are we going to advocate for and who we aren't. That is the world we are in. It's not the world we're trained for. It may not have been what we went into science and technology looking for, but it's a world we're in, and it's a world that we do not get equipped to cope with in even a remotely professional and moral way without just having horrible sleepless nights and wondering what you've done wrong and so on. We ought to be able to do a little better than that. I think the crucial role for universities, even in this country, certainly around much of the developing world, is one needs safe spaces in which scientists and engineers can actually do the work that through all this other collaborative stuff and so on, they have judged to be as close as they can contribute to the public interest without fear that they are going to be sacked or have their careers terminated or never be given a grant again or kill their tenure possibilities. Can the Maine Center for Sustainable Solutions be that? Too early to tell, but that's the challenge we've got out there. Around much of the rest of the world, these are often literally safe spaces. They are where some of the International Agricultural Research System institutes co-appoint really quite brilliant researchers technically working for the government in the countries they serve. What they end up doing is providing a place that the research results those folks discover that are not consistent with government policy can be passed on to their colleagues and come out of the research institute instead of out of the government scientists. It's mundane, but it matters hugely. And this safe space provision is, I think, what we've got to recognize that science in action is about. So, how do we do all this? We try to accomplish all this stuff. People who have heard me talk before know that at this stage I would usually close off with an argument which is dear to my heart. It's where a lot of my own research sits. And it's about what I and my colleagues have called the critical role of boundary work. That is, of individuals and institutions who are willing to live a good part of their life in the uncomfortable interstices between bench researchers and people on the front lines of development, whether that's families or corporations or government leaders, to work back and forth trying to get these conversations going, trying to push for adaptive, error-prone approaches rather than fixed, locked in stone ones, and so on down my list. And what we find is that these folks that I have called boundary spanners, both organizationally, and we've had some, the Office of Naval Research was in US history a classic one of these that spent its entire career connecting boat drivers with hydrodynamicists at Columbia University and the like to amazing results. It's what many of the international agricultural and health research institutes do. The weird thing is these are entirely vulnerable positions. There's no organization chart I've ever seen that has a position for boundary spanners on it. You're not quite liked by people on either side because you're neither quite the techie or quite the hardline political or business leader. You're always the first to go, every institution I've ever seen, when budgets get tight, because they say, well, geez, we don't really need that, that's a luxury. And yet, in case after case after case, when you finally go through all the data and the interviews, turns out, as people point out, usually this single person, sometimes this institution supporting a person, that was instrumental in getting the various sides together, natural scientists and social scientists, business leaders and technical people, competing sides in a political debate. The boundary spanners matter. So the reason I'm not ending it that way is because, of course, in preparation for this thing, I read not only Senator Mitchell's World on Fire, which I had known as a mere child, but also his subsequent work, and was attracted more and more to his descriptions of what he and even more others have called the role of shuttle diplomacy, the essential character of people who are willing to spend immense amounts of their time, energy, health, credibility, doing the hard work of moving back between people whose natural tendency isn't to listen to one another, to talk with instead of at one another, to look for cooperative or joint solutions, and to help them find those partnerships for themselves. That, which I call boundary spanning, but I think I will henceforth call shuttle diplomacy role, I think is really where many of us with ambitions to be techies who matter end up finding ourselves. We are trying to make good things happen, and it turns out that we have to do that by living in a bunch of different worlds and universes that we only partly understand. We're sort of like Moliere's bourgeois gentilhomme, in that we find we've been speaking prose all our lives. The name of the prose is shuttle diplomacy. It's time we turn over the podium to learn from the master, which I very much look forward to. Thank you, Senator Mitchell. Thank you.
We're going to take some time for a few questions, and we have a couple people, Bridie and Brett, in the audience with microphones. Because this is being recorded, please let them know you'd like to ask a question, and they'll come to you so your question will be recorded.
Very good. Thank you for a fine lecture. My name is Jim Lebrecht. I'm from Bangor. And regarding your talk, and I think there's been a problem for the last 20 or so years with information being bottlenecked or not being put out into the public. That is the result of a lot of our efforts. That I guess it's sort of, nobody wants to break the bad news. I'll set the foundation by giving you a few examples. Small windmills that they were selling for homes and businesses, $16,000. Looking at the actual output of these over time, puts out less than 500 kilowatt hours a year. It takes 876 kilowatt hours a year to run a 100-watt light bulb. And so $16,000 of hopes and policies and tax credits and a lot of political push behind it. And nobody's giving that information out to the public. It's sort of hushed up. Big windmills that we see around the state here, growing in the state. were to get us off from oil. Well, looking at the actual numbers, you'd need 47 Mars Hill-sized mountains in each of Maine's 16 counties to just get Maine homes heating with oil from that. Now, people aren't getting this kind of information, and I don't see that kind of information coming out of the university to educate the people on these types of things. What do you think the real problem is here with the negative, well, I don't want to say it's negative, the actual factual information that may perceive to be negative is why is it not getting out into the public?
You want a guy from Massachusetts to tell you why Maine works the way it does? This sounds to me like something my mother would have told me never to do. I think without pretending to know the situation in Maine, the way I would think of something like this is the current energy system is so stacked with past subsidies, and I don't even say that in a bad way. We built oil lines, we built railroads to move coal and so on. Totally sensible thing to do. But it says there is nothing approaching a level playing field in the energy sector anywhere in the world today. You have what the technology people call path dependence, things that got in early, got a bunch of structure, got a bunch of political interests involved with them. So my starting point would simply be if we want to change the energy structure, which we bloody well better, if we don't want to cook ourselves and maybe poison ourselves first, we've got to do, we are going to have to be incredibly open to trying out bunches of stuff, most of which won't work, and the vast majority of which won't look anywhere nearly as good as the stuff that is already there benefiting from the subsidies and history we have. So I'm not giving a brief for or against any of these technologies you have, but in trying to break the mold against sets of technologies that have long histories, I do think, because we're so bad at forecasting what's going to work and what hasn't, a society has to be pretty tolerant of trying out lots of stuff and taking a somewhat long view on whether what starts out as a really inefficient thing will then lead to improvements that get better. But again, that's a general answer, not a main answer.
Yes, I enjoyed your talk very much. My name is Frank Drummond. I'm at the University of Maine. I work in agriculture. And when I was listening to your talk, my sort of perspective was that it was still very much sort of had a very much a university researcher perspective. And you stopped sort of maybe a little short talking about the boundary spanning. And so I'm wondering, is there a lot we can do maybe from an alternative idea, and how do we get the public pushing the system more instead of maybe researchers coming up with a problem or the solutions to problems that they perceive, but more how do we get the governments, the citizens that are, sort of supporting the institutions that maybe can solve the problems. What's that side of the equation? Because I didn't hear you talk too much about that part.
You're completely correct. But it's not because I don't believe it's important. I start all of my classes on this kind of stuff and the science of sustainable development by saying, look, guys, we are the support troops, precisely because moving ahead on almost any sustainable development agenda I can imagine has this strongly redistributive character to it. That is, it is going to be very few win-wins and a whole lot of status quo losing position. It is first and foremost a hardball political game. So what we need is radicalism in the streets. It is things like the climate marches last Sunday, but then translated into real action. My question is, the question I addressed today, given the invitation and the character of the setting, was how we, coming in from the research, scholarship, and invention end, can try to be more part of the support for those radicalized and political efforts we need, rather than end up, however unconsciously and unintentionally, being part of the preservation of the status quo. but you're correct. Without the political activism, we're not getting there.
So to honor Bill, we're giving him a traditional Wabanaki brown ash and sweetgrass basket woven by Penobscot Indian master basket weaver Pam Outdoosis Little Pathway Cunningham. She's the daughter of Sipsis, a renowned Penobscot poet and artist, and as we sit here on an island in the middle of Penobscot River, the traditional lands of the Penobscot people. Thank you, Bill.
You can have no idea how welcome this is. The corners of my stairwells at home are punctuated with baskets from various groups across the western coast of North America and the southeast, where I've spent time, and I can only say this will have great company and will enrich the neighborhood. Thank you so much.
Because of Bill's background starting out as, and he used this term once, a bug squeezer, which means he's some kind of research entomologist, I'm going to say a little bit more about this basket because it connects with these complex issues. So Pam Cunningham and other members of the Maine Indian Basket Makers Alliance have been working diligently for several years with one of the Sustainability Solutions Initiative teams to protect Maine's ash resources, the material for this amazing millennium-long tradition. And this project seeks to slow the invasion of, Bill will know, a little buprested beetle, the emerald ash borer, so that the ash tree devastation that has occurred in the Midwest, where hundreds of millions of ash have died in the last 15 or so years, does not threaten the key cultural and economic resource in Maine. And so Wabanaki basket makers, which include those from the Penobscot Nation, the Passamaquoddy tribe, the Aroostook band of the Micmacs, and the Holton band of Maliseets, and other resource users are likely to be hugely impacted when this invasion occurs. It's very close. And what we're trying to do as a partnership is to find ways to ensure that these baskets and this material culture can continue. This work symbolizes what we're fighting for so diligently as a part of the Mitchell Center for Sustainability Solutions, preserving Maine's diverse cultures and ways of life, including their economic and environmental well-being. So again, thank you so much, Bill. It's now my great pleasure to welcome President Susan Hunter to the podium and express my deep appreciation for her extraordinary dedication, collaborative spirit, and principled leadership in this pivotal time in UMaine's history. President Hunter.
Well, thank you, David. It is my great pleasure to introduce Senator George Mitchell, one of the most distinguished citizens in our state's history. Senator Mitchell is known throughout Maine, the nation, and the world as a remarkable leader who has worked steadfastly to solve some of our most difficult challenges. Whether leading the effort to reauthorize the Clean Air Act as Senate Majority Leader, chairing the peace process in Northern Ireland, investigating the problem of performance-enhancing drugs in Major League Baseball, or seeking peace in the Middle East, Senator Mitchell is widely admired for his sense of hope, his deep humility, his integrity, and his unwavering belief that we can and should work together to solve our problems and create a better world. It is especially fitting that Senator Mitchell is with us today as we announce the official launch of the newly renamed Mitchell Center for Sustainability Solutions. For more than 5 years, UMaine's Mitchell Center has served as the nerve center for the Sustainability Solutions Initiative, one of the most ambitious programs ever begun at Maine's land-grant university. Supported in part by a $20 million grant from the National Science Foundation's EPSCoR program, This experimental initiative has blazed new trails in finding solutions to problems that require an ability to reconcile intersecting environmental, social, and economic concerns. Today, I am happy to report that this novel institutional initiative has been a great success. Indeed, by creating a permanent Mitchell Center for Sustainability Solutions, we are celebrating the fact that UMaine has emerged as a national and international leader in tackling the kinds of complex problems that Senator Mitchell has worked on throughout his long and extraordinary career. Problems that require collaboration, persistence, flexibility, and an unwavering commitment to public service. By demonstrating how universities and colleges can build strong partnerships with communities, create nimble, interdisciplinary teams that draw on the diverse expertise of faculty and students, and focus on linking knowledge with action, we seek to follow Senator Mitchell's example, in this case by showing how higher education can make a difference in a world filled with enormous challenges as well as great opportunities. So I want to thank Senator Mitchell for serving as a wonderful role model and source of inspiration for this work, and emphasize how committed we are and have been to ensuring the long-term success of the Mitchell Center. Now, please join me in welcoming a world statesman, an extraordinary American, a true blue Mainer, and a great source of inspiration for the Mitchell Center for Sustainability Solutions, Senator George Mitchell.
Thank you very much, President Hunter, for your generous comments and your support for this center. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your presence here today and for your warm response. Susan Hunter has been at the University of Maine for 28 years, devoted most of her adult working life to this great university. And I believe I speak for the vast majority of students, faculty, alumni, and others in saying how pleased we are that someone who knows, works with, understands this institution, this community, and this state has assumed the leadership of an institution that is so central to our state's future. So please join me in expressing our support and gratitude for Susan Hunter. I join David and others in welcoming Bob and Ellie Cates. It's a pleasure to see you here again. Thank you very much for coming. I want to recognize my sister Barbara and my brother Paul, both of whom are graduates of the University of Maine and who are here today. Would you please stand up and be recognized? As some of you may know, there is a batting pavilion, baseball batting pavilion at the field house that is named after my brother Paul, because he was a great baseball player here at the University of Maine. If any of you doubt it and you have 6 hours, you can ask him about it. Susan mentioned me as a role model, and earlier this morning I had several meetings with different groups, students and faculty, and one student said to me, "You're really a role model for me." I want to tell the students, I think my brother Paul should be the role model. Now here he's got this batting pavilion named after him. How did that happen? Well, he has a place in the history of baseball that no one else has ever achieved. While in high school, in one game, he hit 2 triples, very rare. On both occasions, he was picked off third base by the pitcher. That's never happened in any major league, college, or high school game that's on record. He got so much publicity out of that that he was recruited to come to the University of Maine and play baseball, and he ended up with a pavilion named after him. So I say to you students, we're all human. We all make mistakes. We all do dumb things. The challenge in life is to transfer a dumb thing into a success, the way my brother Paul did in his baseball career. So thank you, Paul, for the inspiration you've provided to all of us. I admire and appreciate Bill Clark's career-long effort to mobilize scientists, decision makers, and others in the increasingly urgent search for solutions to problems at the intersection of the environment and the economy. We're very grateful to Bill for coming up here from Boston to speak to us, but I told him that there is a long history of relationship between Maine and Massachusetts, much of which many people don't fully comprehend. For example, he, like others from Boston, think that Maine used to be part of Massachusetts. We, of course, know better that Massachusetts used to be part of Maine. And once they achieved a little maturity, we were pleased to set them off on their own. And we're proud of what they have accomplished since they've been independent. So please give our best regards to the former colonists in Boston when you return. In addition to history, there's built up in Maine a long lore of humor about Maine and Massachusetts. And so I'd like, in your honor, Bill, I'd like to tell a couple of stories about that. The first one is true, the second one is not. I have a home on Mount Desert Island, and some years ago, it seems like a long time ago, but it wasn't when we still had payphones. I went to the Jordan Pond House in Acadia National Park, and I was with a friend, and we were to meet a third friend there for lunch. The third friend didn't show up, so we went out to call him up on a payphone there. There were two levels there for those of you who've been to the Jordan Pond House, and there used to be a payphone in each level. And at the main level, there was a guy standing at the payphone. He had a card with a lot of numbers on top of it, and he was pouring quarters into it, not getting a good result, and he was cussing and yelling. His wife was standing there, and it became clear that he was from Boston because with a lot of expletive-filled sentences, he was deriding the culture of this backwoods area where even the payphones didn't work. And the line got a little bit longer, and we waited while this tirade continued, anti-Maine sort of. And then the guy behind me tapped me on the shoulder, and he said, "Excuse me, are you Senator Mitchell?" I said, "Yes, I am." He said, "Oh," he said, "are you here on vacation?" I said, "Yeah, just taking a couple of days off at Acadia." So to make conversation, I said, "Are you here on vacation too?" He said, "No, I'm working." I said, "What do you do?" He said, "Well, I'm a telephone repairman." Took a while for that to register with me. And he said, "When that guy from Boston runs out of quarters, I'm going to fix that phone." Then he said, kind of in a conspiratorial voice, he said, "Senator," he said, "if I was you, I'd go downstairs." He said, "because they got a payphone there, and I know it's working because I just fixed it." So I went downstairs and made my call, and he eventually got to fix that one. Now, one other story. This has to do specifically with Cambridge and Harvard. Back in the Depression, a couple of young guys graduated from Harvard, and of course, they had a Harvard degree, but jobs were tough, so they couldn't find work. They're very smart guys, so they hit on making a living by making counterfeit $20 bills. They had an old machine that they fixed up that cranked out $20 bills, and they had a pretty nice living. And one day the machine malfunctioned, and it produced a group of $18 bills. So one of them said, "Well, we can't pass these." He said, "We got to throw these away." The other guy said, No. He said, "Look, I go up to Maine in the summer." He said, "There are a bunch of yokels up there, and there's an old guy who runs a county store. He doesn't know any better. Give me those $18 bills. I'll pass them up there." So he came up to Maine a couple months later, went to the general store, and the old timer was behind the counter, and fancy Harvard guy from Cambridge Committee said, "Say, old timer," he said, "you think you could break an $18 bill?" The old guy looked at him, he said, "Sure, no problem." He said, "What do you want, 2 9s or 3 6s?" So remember that, Bill. Well, let me say a few serious words. Beginning at a very young age, I and my brothers and my sister experienced firsthand the challenges of reconciling economic development and environmental protection. We grew up in Waterville directly on the banks of the Kennebec River, which then was the source of power for some of the textile mills in which my mother worked. It was also the source of enormous pollution. I can remember as a small boy standing directly on the riverbank, smelling the foul odor, feeling the sting in my eyes from the chemicals discharged from textile, paper mills, and other industrial facilities. Later, I gained a deeper appreciation for this tension when, in my late 20s, I joined the Senate staff of the greatest environmental legislator in American history, Maine's own Ed Muskie. He grew up in Rumford on the banks of the Androscoggin River and also with a paper mill. And so Ed Muskie knew all about society's never-ending struggle to strike an effective balance between the critical need for jobs, the equally important need for clean air and clean water. As Bill discussed earlier, and as we all know, these tensions are at the heart of the challenge of sustainable development. That development seeks to improve human well-being while protecting our planet's life support systems. In pursuing sustainable development, we need to focus not only on the way we want the world to work today, but also on the world we want to leave for future generations. How can we make decisions that will produce a strong economy now with thriving communities and a healthy environment, and at the same time ensure that future generations have more opportunities, not fewer, as a consequence of our actions? Now, many decades after I began working for Ed Muskie, I often reflect on the progress we've made, the challenges that lie ahead, and what we've learned along the way. When I was in the Senate, I learned that science can play a central role in tackling difficult problems like acid rain. Scientific research is important because it can help us understand the causes and consequences of these problems, and also potential options and the consequences of those options. As Bill emphasized, there's no guarantee that scientific knowledge will lead to effective social action. And I confess that I'm often deeply dismayed to hear and read public statements by national elected officials who engage in what can only be called the denial of science, an effort to disregard or discredit scientists and scientific discovery to protect political positions and long-held but demonstrably wrong views. We need to examine the barriers that impede our efforts to link knowledge with action and to do our best to find and implement strategies to permit meaningful change. Bill used the word shuttle diplomacy. I've spent a lot of time working that way, whether dealing with problems as Senate Majority Leader, in conflict resolution in Northern Ireland or the Middle East, or right here in Maine. I tried hard to understand and overcome the barriers that arise in situations where the solution requires many individuals and institutions with different and competing views to find a way to work together. This requires an extraordinary commitment to listening to the strong and deeply held views of men and women, to understand their real concerns, their true objections, and to try to find common ground. It also requires a lot of patience. Sometimes you have to ignore the naysayers. For example, just 4 days before we reached the peace agreement in Northern Ireland, after decades of conflict and years of negotiation, a poll was published in which 83% of the public said there was no chance of ever reaching an agreement. Rather than giving up, that caused us to redouble our efforts, and 4 days later, we reached an agreement. I've been particularly gratified to learn that many of the students and the faculty connected with the Mitchell Center and its precursor, the Sustainability Solutions Initiative, are developing their own skills in shuttle diplomacy, demonstrating a commitment to listen to all sides, to gain a deeper understanding of the concerns and goals of all of the stakeholders. They're trying to ensure that their work is open and their processes transparent. They're gaining respect by giving it. To be sure, they're also learning firsthand that the road to solutions is often long and winding, and that persistence is essential to success. In a larger sense, the ethos of their work reflects one of my deepest beliefs: the importance of public service. The many faculty and students involved in the Mitchell Center have committed themselves to a goal larger than their individual lives, the goal of helping to build a better world, starting right here in our own communities, in our own state. They're helping to create a cadre of educated citizens, flexible thinkers, solutions-oriented scholars who will be prepared to respond to the challenges of the future. Their work serves as a beacon for other colleges and other universities, all of whom want to try to help society chart a more sustainable path. I believe the long-term rewards of such work significantly outweigh the difficulties involved. And to all of these scholars, students, graduate degree, those seeking higher degrees, faculty, everyone, a real thank you, not just from me, but from all here and from those in the future who will not know of your efforts, but who will benefit from them. By articulating a common vision, by building partnerships, by focusing on the needs of others, and listening to and respecting others, in particular those with whom you disagree, you're helping to create a brighter future for Maine, for our nation, and for the world. Thank you all, ladies and gentlemen, and I'll be pleased now to take a couple of questions from the audience.
Hi, my name's Larry. My wife works for the senator. We're about to have an election, and in that election, we're about to re-elect a senator by 60, 70%, whatever it be. And my fear is she's going to go back when Republicans take over, and she's going to put Senator Mitchell, the senator from Cole, in charge of the Senate. And she'll put Senator Imhoff, the senator from Oklahoma, in charge of science. Senator Imhoff totally denies the existence of science, even though he's a doctor. How do you stop that sort of thing? You know, unless you follow what Miss Snow does, or excuse me, what Miss Collins does, how are you going to know that she's going to do these things and the implications of what they are, and how do you fight it? Thank you.
Well, I'll make some comments, but I want to say in advance that we've tried hard over the years to make this a nonpartisan program and a nonpartisan event. I'm going to leave here and go to a partisan event where I will express myself more fully than I will here now. but I don't want to get into the habit of making politically based statements at these events, because I think it would lose some of its attraction and broad appeal, and maybe get the university in a situation they don't want to be in. The answer is, of course, that you cannot know in advance what a person is going to do in or out of politics. And every day we make assessments about individuals in our families, at our work, in the political process and others, about the extent to which we have confidence and trust in the words spoken to us, either directly or indirectly through the media, and we assess them based upon the totality of our knowledge and the context in which they're made. I do think that there is a difference between the political parties, and people tend to generally line up behind those parties whose values are closer to the individuals than the other. We make value judgments of that type in the political process. And we also, of course, need to include in our consideration the context in which our decisions are made. And one of those concerns is the one you expressed, control of the Senate, and what will be the consequence of that in terms of the environment and environmental protection. It's a very serious matter, and each individual must make his or her own decision, but you've no doubt called attention to a problem that arises when we elect individuals in large part based upon their own qualities, but also have to take into account the context in which they operate and the indirect consequences of their election. So I won't go any further than that now for fear of crossing a line that I really prefer not to cross in this context.
I'm Nancy from Massachusetts and Maine. I'd like to know your opinion of climate warming that's been debated so between the Dems and the Republicans.
Yeah, what's your question?
What is your opinion, your personal opinion on climate warming?
Yes. I believe that the evidence is overwhelming that man-made activities are having a profound effect on the climate globally, with potentially catastrophic consequences for human beings all over the world. While it is no doubt true that the scientific consensus is just that, a consensus, not unanimous, while there are and will remain deniers who insist that the evidence be unanimous, the fact is, of course, were we to wait for that, the disastrous effects would have already descended upon the world, and it would be too late to make the necessary changes. There's nothing new about this. There was a very long controversy thousands of years ago over whether or not the earth revolved around the sun or the sun revolved around the earth. There was a very long controversy over whether the earth was flat or round, and they continue to the current day. I believe that those public officials who describe the assertions of climate change as a hoax or a liberal conspiracy or in such vague and general terms are engaging in a huge disservice, not just to their constituents, not just to people in the United States, but people all over the world. It represents one of the greatest threats to the future of humanity in all of known human history, and it requires a great deal more effort and leadership than has been the case to date. I acknowledge I'm not a scientist. I don't know the answer to every question, and I'm certain that even the greatest scientists don't know the answer to every single question. But it's interesting that we human beings make some of the most important decisions in life on less than total knowledge. Not one of you knew every single thing about your spouse when you married him or her. You accepted jobs, made decisions on where to live, where to send your children to school, decisions of enormous personal consequence in the lives of every human on less than total knowledge. And so this so-called standard that there has to be unanimity, that every single question must be answered with finality and certainty before we can take the first step to approve it, is like a guy saying that if someone attacks me, I can't defend, and he holds up a big knife and he threatens me, that I can't defend myself until the knife is in me, and then I'm certain of what his intention is. I think that common sense, reasonable judgment tells you that we do not have to wait until climate change reaches a point of irreversibility and future generations suffer catastrophic consequences because of our failure of will, or worse still, our obligation to interests whose desire is to maintain the status quo. Change in human affairs is inevitable. Change has always occurred. Change has always been feared by humans. But we've demonstrated a remarkable ability to adapt, to meet challenges, particularly in our own country. And I'll just close by saying that every one of us, and I believe this deeply, has an obligation to our children, our grandchildren, and well into the future to do what we can to act now in a political context to try to deal with the issue and to take into account when we engage in the democratic process of the necessity of having people in public positions who do not engage in what I regard as an incredibly short-sighted and wrong-headed denial of science with respect to climate change and global warming. Other than that, I have no opinion. Thank you all very much.
To thank Senator Mitchell, not nearly as much as I'd like to. I just want to present him with this spalted bowl, turn bowl of spalted maple by a Maine artist, George Partal, who's also, in his day job, orthopedic trauma surgeon at Eastern Maine Medical Center. Thank you, Senator Mitchell.
That's nice. Thank you all very much. Thank you, David.
On behalf of the UMaine community and the entire team of the sustainability faculty and students who've been working together for the last 5 years, I want to express my deep appreciation to Professor Clark and Senator Mitchell for sharing their powerful visions and hopes for the future. I know they've given us great food for thought. And speaking of food, I hope you'll join us about 100 yards that way, down in the grand foyer of the Collins Center for our reception. Once again, please join me in thanking Professor Clark and Senator Mitchell.